The hybrid child's cry. The mining station 442B floated in the void like a metal tumor against the stars, its industrial corridors humming with the constant vibration of excavation equipment. Deep within its bowels, past the worker dormitories and supply depots, lay a section that officially didn't exist on any station schematic. Here, in the shadows of forgotten maintenance shafts and abandoned storage bays, lived those the galaxy preferred to ignore. Pressed her small face against the cold porthole, watching the endless dance of cargo ships and military vessels outside. Her breath fogged the reinforced glass as she traced the outline of a passing destroyer with one clawed finger. At 7 years old, she was already taller than most human children her age, her reptilian heritage evident in the subtle scales that traced her jawline and the golden, vertically slitted eyes that could see clearly in the station's perpetual twilight. Behind her in the makeshift nest they called home, her mother stirred restlessly. The great dragon's breathing was labored, each exhale a whistle of pain through damaged vocal cords. What had once been a magnificent creature capable of soaring between star systems now lay curled in a space barely large enough to contain her bulk, her once brilliant emerald scales dulled to the color of old copper. Mother's voice carried the musical quality of her draconic heritage, each word resonating with harmonics that human throats could never produce. "Are you feeling better today?" His massive head lifted slightly, one amber eye focusing on her daughter with effort that spoke of tremendous pain. When she spoke, her voice was a broken whisper, nothing like the commanding roar that had once echoed across battlefields. "I am managing, little star, come here." Abandoned her vigil at the porthole and padded across the metal floor on bare feet, her hybrid nature allowing her to move with a silence that would have impressed any military scout. She settled against her mother's great flank, feeling the steady thrum of the dragon's heart beneath scales that had grown thin and brittle over the years of exile. "Tell me about the pilots again," whispered, as she had every day for as long as she could remember. His eye closed, and for a moment the only sound was the distant hum of the station's life support systems. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of memories that stretched back centuries. "They were called the Void Dancers," she began, using the ancient draconic term that translated poorly into any human language. "Humans who flew metal birds between the stars, fighting alongside our kind when the galaxy was younger and hope was not yet a luxury we couldn't afford." Had heard this story hundreds of times, but she never tired of it. In her mind, she could see them as her mother described. Pilots in sleek fighters, their faces hidden behind helmets that gleamed like mirrors, flying in perfect formation with dragons through nebulae that painted the void in impossible colors. "Your father was one of them," continued, her voice growing softer. "Commander of the Terra Defense Corps, the bravest human I ever knew and the only one who ever looked at a dragon and saw not a weapon to be controlled, but a partner to be respected." The story always grew hazy here, clouded by pain and loss that had never fully shared. Knew only fragments, that the war had ended, that alliances had shifted, that dragons had become inconvenient reminders of a time the new galactic government preferred to forget. She knew that her father had died defending evacuation ships, and that her mother had fled to the outer systems with her still-growing daughter, seeking refuge among the forgotten and the exiled. "But the pilots," pressed gently, "some of them are still alive." "Some," confirmed, "scattered across the galaxy flying cargo routes and escort missions. The lucky ones found work with mining companies or exploration fleets. The unlucky ones," she trailed off but could fill in the blanks. She had seen the veterans in the station's lower levels, human and alien alike, their eyes hollow with the weight of wars that no one wanted to remember. A sudden vibration through the station's hull interrupted their conversation, followed by the distant wail of emergency sirens. Felt her mother's body tense beneath her, muscles coiling with an instinctive response to danger that years of captivity hadn't diminished. "What is it?" asked, though part of her already knew. The mining station's location on the edge of civilized space made it a frequent target for raiders, pirates, and worse things that lurked in the dark between stars. Before could answer, the lights went out. Emergency lighting kicked in a moment later, bathing everything in hellish red. Through the porthole, could see the running lights of unknown ships moving with predatory grace around the station. They were sleek and angular, their hulls painted in the matte black that absorbed sensor sweeps and made them nearly invisible against the void. Hissed the word carrying overtones of ancient hatred. "They've found us." They were among the galaxy's horrors. a species that had emerged from the dark spaces between spiral arms with technology that seemed to mock the laws of physics. They took what they wanted and destroyed what they couldn't use, leaving behind empty hulls and silent corridors where once there had been life and laughter. The station shuddered again, this time from weapon impacts rather than engine vibrations. Somewhere in the distance, could hear the rapid staccato of emergency broadcasts, voices speaking in the clipped tones of people who knew they were about to die. "We have to run," said, but even as the words left her lips, she knew how foolish they sounded. Where could a sick dragon and a hybrid child run to? The station's few escape pods were undoubtedly already claimed by those with the credits or connections to secure passage. The forgotten and the exiled would be left behind, as they always were. Tried to rise, her great body uncoiling with agonizing slowness. The effort sent spasms of pain through her damaged nervous system, and she collapsed back to the floor with a grinding crash that sent vibrations through the surrounding bulkheads. "I cannot," she gasped, her voice barely audible. "The neural damage, I can barely move, let alone fly." Felt something cold and hard settle in her stomach. She had always known this day might come, had seen it in her nightmares and in the worried glances her mother tried to hide. But knowing and experiencing were different things entirely. The sounds of battle grew closer. Through the porthole, she could see the bright flashes of energy weapons and the silent explosions of atmosphere venting into space. A cargo hauler tried to make a run for it, its engines flaring blue-white against the darkness, but interceptors fell on it like wolves. The hauler's destruction was brief and brilliant, its death serving only to illuminate the predators that circled the station. "Listen to me," said, her voice carrying a note of desperate urgency. "There is something I never told you, little star, something I saved for when you were old enough to understand." Turned away from the carnage outside to focus on her mother's words. "Your heritage is not just draconic and human," continued. "There is something else, something that sleeps in your blood, your father. He was more than just a pilot. He was chosen, marked by something that the humans call the quantum field, but we know by older names." "I don't understand," said, though she could feel something stirring in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the station's failing life support. "When dragons and humans love truly," explained, her words coming faster as the sounds of battle drew nearer, "sometimes their children are born with gifts that transcend flesh and bone. You can reach across the void, little star. You can call to those who share the bond of sky and space." As if to emphasize her words, another explosion rocked the station. This time the lights didn't come back on and could hear the hiss of atmosphere leaking through damaged seals. "The pilots," whispered, understanding beginning to dawn. "You mean I can call to the pilots?" "Not just call," said. "You can make them hear you across any distance, can make them feel what you feel. It is a gift that has not been seen for generations, and it may be our only hope." The warmth in his chest was growing stronger, spreading through her body like liquid sunlight. She could feel something vast and interconnected just beyond her perception, a web of consciousness that spanned the galaxy. And somewhere in that web, she could sense familiar presences, minds shaped by years of flight, hearts that remembered what it meant to dance with dragons among the stars. "How?" she asked. "Close your eyes," instructed. "Feel for the connections, the bonds that tie all pilots together. They may be scattered and forgotten, but they are still there. Find them, little star, call them home." Closed her eyes and reached out with senses she had never known she possessed. The station around her seemed to fade, replaced by a vast darkness filled with points of light. Each light was a mind, a soul, a life lived in the endless void between worlds. Most were strangers, their thoughts foreign and incomprehensible, but some burned with a familiar fire. She found them scattered across a dozen star systems. Pilots flying freight runs through asteroid fields, ex-military aviators working security for mining companies, veterans whose best days were supposedly behind them. They were old now, their reflexes perhaps not what they once were, but the fire that had made them willing to fly alongside dragons still burned in their hearts. Reached out to that fire and spoke without words, her message carrying across the quantum foam that underlay reality itself. "They wounded my dragon mother." The response was immediate and electric. Across the galaxy, in cockpits both humble and proud, pilots felt a child's voice echo in their minds. They felt her fear, her desperation, and beneath it all, her unshakable faith that they would not abandon her. "Who is this?" came a gruff mental voice, its owner somewhere in the system. "Where are you, little one?" asked another, this one from a pilot currently hauling ore through the asteroid belts of Vega. "We hear you," came a chorus of voices, dozens of them now. Men and women who had flown with dragons and remembered what it meant to be part of something greater than themselves. Sighs snapped open, tears streaming down her scaled cheeks. "I found them," she gasped. "I found the pilots." But even as she spoke, the sounds of battle were drawing closer. Emergency lighting flickered as power systems failed, and she could hear the distinctive whine of energy weapons cutting through bulkheads. They were running out of time. "Tell them where we are," urged. "Tell them what they face." Closed her eyes again and pushed her consciousness outward, sharing everything. The mining station's coordinates, the attack, her mother's injuries, their desperate situation. She held nothing back, letting the pilots feel her terror and her hope in equal measure. The response was swift and decisive. "Hold on, little sister," came a voice she somehow knew belonged to a woman named Sarah, currently flying a patrol route near the system. "We're coming." All of us added another pilot, his thoughts carrying the weight of command authority. "Tell your mother that Phoenix Squadron remembers its debts." More voices joined the chorus, pilots abandoning their routes and missions, their ships turning toward a mining station on the edge of nowhere. Some were close enough to arrive within hours. Others would take days to reach them. But they were coming, all of them, drawn by the cry of a hybrid child who had never stopped believing in the bonds that tied dragons and pilots together. As opened her eyes and shared the news with her mother, she saw something she had never seen before, was weeping. Great silver tears rolled down the dragon's snout, each one carrying the weight of hope deferred and faith finally rewarded. "They remember," whispered. "After all these years, they still remember." The station shuddered again, and this time the sound of tearing metal was accompanied by the hiss of more atmosphere venting into space. Through the porthole, could see boarding parties cutting their way through the hull with surgical precision. They would reach the forgotten sectors soon, and when they did. But for the first time in her young life, wasn't afraid. Somewhere in the darkness between stars, pilots who had once danced with dragons were pushing their ships to the limit, racing against time to answer a child's call for help. They might not arrive in time to save the station, but they would come. Of that, she was certain. The warmth in her chest pulsed like a second heartbeat, and she could feel the approaching pilots like distant stars growing brighter with each passing moment. They were coming home, and the galaxy was about to remember why dragons and humans had once been allies. In the darkness of their hidden refuge, mother and daughter waited together, no longer alone in a hostile universe. Somewhere above them, the last defenders of the mining station were making their final stand. Somewhere beyond the hull, warriors were preparing to claim their prize. But somewhere in the void between worlds, the void dancers were coming home. The pilot's answer. The first to arrive was Sarah Martinez, former lieutenant commander of the 3rd Expeditionary Wing, now flying an aging freight hauler called the Stubborn Mule through the outer systems. Whence cry had echoed through her mind 3 hours earlier, she had been hauling medical supplies to a colony world on the rim. Without hesitation, she had dumped her cargo into space and pushed her ship's engines beyond their safety limits. The mule dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the 442 system with a violent shudder that spoke of components pushed far past their recommended tolerances. Sarah's hands flew over her control panel, her fingers finding switches and dials by muscle memory, even as her eyes took in the tactical display that painted the system in stark, urgent colors. The mining station hung in space like a dying ember, its hull breached in dozens of places. Ships moved around it with the casual confidence of predators feeding on a carcass. Sarah counted at least 12 attack craft and 3 larger vessels that could only be boarding ships. Whatever resistance the station had offered was clearly over. "Phoenix leader to any Phoenix," she broadcast on the old squadron frequency, her voice steady despite the rage building in her chest. "I'm in system and reading multiple hostiles. Anyone else out there?" The response came immediately, crackling with static from a dozen different ships spread across local space. "Phoenix 7 here, Sarah." The voice belonged to whom she remembered as a hotshot rookie with more guts than sense. 20 years later, his voice carried the weight of a man who had seen too much. "I'm flying a patrol cutter about 10 minutes out from your position, reading the same hostile contacts." "Phoenix 12 reporting," came another voice, this one belonging to Sarah could hear the whine of overtaxed engines in the background. Civilian cargo hauler armed with whatever I could bolt to the hull on short notice. ETA 15 minutes. More voices joined the chorus as pilots continued to drop out of hyperspace. James Kirk in a modified mining ship, David Park flying a courier vessel, Maria Santos in what sounded like a barely functional planetary hopper. They came in ones and twos, their ships a motley collection of civilian craft and military surplus, but their voices carried the same steady determination that Sarah remembered from their days as a unified squadron. "Phoenix Leader, this is Phoenix 3, came a voice that made Sarah's heart skip. Colonel David Hayes, their former commanding officer, broadcasting from what the sensors identified as a heavy military transport. "I've got a full load of Marine reserves who were supposed to be running a training exercise. Permission to crash the party." Sarah found herself smiling for the first time in hours. "Permission granted, Phoenix 3. It's good to hear your voice, sir." "Save the reunion for later, Martinez," Hayes replied, though she could hear the warmth in his voice. "What's our tactical situation?" Sarah pulled up her sensor readings and shared them across the squadron frequency. 12 attack craft, 3 boarding vessels, and what looks like a command ship hanging back at medium range. The station's been breached in multiple locations, and I'm not reading any active defensive systems. "Any word from the little one?" asked. As if summoned by his question, his voice echoed through their minds again, weaker than before, but still carrying that impossible mix of fear and hope that had drawn them across the galaxy. "They're in the station now. They're hunting us, but my mother, she's trying to hide our scent. She's in so much pain." The mental connection carried more than words. Sarah could feel the child's terror, the claustrophobic press of the hiding space, the labored breathing of a dragon slowly dying from old wounds. But beneath it all was something else, an unshakable faith that the pilots would not abandon her. "Jesus Christ," whispered, "she's just a kid." "A kid calling for help," Hayes said grimly. "Phoenix Squadron, this is a combat operation. Primary objective is the extraction of friendlies from the mining station. Secondary objective is the elimination of hostile forces. Rules of engagement are weapons-free against any contact." Sarah checked her ship's weapon systems and tried not to wince. The mule had been built for hauling cargo, not fighting wars. Her armament consisted of a single point defense laser and whatever mining charges she happened to have in storage. Around her, she knew the other pilots were making similar calculations and reaching similar conclusions. They were outnumbered and flying ships that had never been intended for combat. By any reasonable tactical analysis, they were about to commit suicide. "Phoenix Leader," Hayes continued, "I need you to coordinate a distraction. Draw their fighters away from the station while my Marines and I try to find a way inside." "Copy that, Phoenix 3, Sarah replied, pushing her ship's throttles forward. "All Phoenix fighters form up on me. We're going to show these bastards what happens when you mess with our people." The response was immediate. Across local space, the scattered pilots adjusted course and began to converge on the mining station. Their ships were mismatched, and their weapons were improvised, but they flew with a precision that spoke of countless hours spent in formation during humanity's darkest hour. They noticed them immediately. Sarah watched her tactical display as the alien fighters disengaged from the station and began to spread out in an intercept formation. They were known for their technological superiority and their cold, calculating approach to warfare. They fought like a computer program, efficient and emotionless, bringing overwhelming firepower to bear with mathematical precision. They had never fought Phoenix Squadron. "Remember your training," Sarah broadcast as the range closed. "They're faster than us and their weapons hit harder, but they can't match human intuition. Don't think, just fly." The first engagement was a swirling melee that painted space with energy beams and missile trails. Sarah threw the mule into a spiraling dive that would have torn apart most civilian ships, using the freighter's heavy construction to absorb impacts that would have vaporized a fighter. Her point defense laser licked out at an interceptor, scoring hits along its sleek hull before the alien ship twisted away with serpentine grace. Around her, the battle developed with the chaotic beauty that had made Phoenix Squadron legendary. In his patrol, Cutter used his ship's superior acceleration to dart between larger opponents, his weapons striking at critical systems before disengaging. Coordinated with 2 other pilots to execute a perfect weave, their overlapping fields of fire creating a deadly web that caught two fighters in a crossfire. But the aliens were adapting, as they always did. Sarah watched in growing alarm as they began to fight with increasing coordination, their ships moving in perfect synchronization as they brought their superior numbers to bear. "Phoenix Leader, I'm taking heavy damage," reported James Kirk, his voice tight with pain. "Weapons offline, engines at 30%. I'm not going to last much longer." Sarah cursed under her breath as she watched Kirk's mining ship struggle to evade a pair of fighters that were methodically taking it apart. The aliens had identified the weakest member of the squadron and were moving to eliminate him with ruthless efficiency. "All units converge on Phoenix 9's position," she ordered, even as she knew it was probably too late. That was when the unexpected happened. From the mining station came a sound that had not been heard in the galaxy for over a decade, the roar of a dragon preparing for battle. It was weak and broken, barely a whisper compared to the war cries that had once echoed across battlefields, but it carried across the vacuum as clearly as if we're standing beside them. On the tactical display, Sarah watched in amazement as something emerged from the station's damaged hull. It was barely recognizable as a dragon, its one-sprowed form reduced to a shadow of its former magnificence, but it flew with a determination that spoke of ancient pride and desperate love. Had somehow found the strength to leave her hiding place. The dragon's emergence changed everything. The fighters, programmed to prioritize threats based on destructive potential, immediately identified her as a primary target. They disengaged from their attacks on the human pilots and began to converge on the wounded dragon with single-minded focus. "Mother, no!" His mental cry was anguish made manifest, her terror and desperation washing over the pilots like a physical blow. Sarah realized what the dragon was doing, was offering herself as bait, drawing the enemy away from both the human pilots and the hiding place where her daughter waited. It was a noble sacrifice, and one that would end with her death unless they acted quickly. "All units, new plan," Sarah broadcast, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent years leading pilots into impossible situations. "The dragon is our priority. Form up defensive positions and keep those bastards off her." The response was immediate and decisive. Phoenix Squadron had flown alongside dragons before, had learned to fight as partners rather than rivals. The old instincts came flooding back as they moved into protective formations around, their weapons reaching out to intercept any fighter that came within range. But the dragon was wounded, her flight erratic and painfully slow. Sarah could see the damage that years of captivity had inflicted, withered wing membranes that could barely support her weight, scales dulled by malnutrition, movements that spoke of constant agony. Was flying on willpower alone, and that willpower was fatting fast. "Phoenix 3 to all units," Hayes's voice cut through the chaos of battle. "I'm reading massive energy buildup from the command ship. Whatever they're planning, we need to end this now." Sarah glanced at her tactical display and felt her blood turn to ice. The command ship was powering weapons that could vaporize the entire mining station. They had apparently decided that the presence of a dragon, even a wounded one, represented too great a threat to ignore. They were preparing to eliminate the problem with overwhelming force. "How long until they fire?" Sarah asked. 3 minutes, maybe less," Hayes replied grimly. Around her, the battle continued with increasing desperation. The Phoenix pilots were holding their own, but barely. Their improvised weapons and civilian ships were taking a beating from the superior technology, and several pilots were reporting critical system failures. That was when S's voice echoed through their minds again, but this time it was different. Instead of fear and desperation, her mental touch carried something else. A strange, building energy that seemed to resonate with something deep in the quantum structure of space itself. "I can feel them," she said, her mental voice carrying harmonics that made reality itself seem to shimmer. "All of them. Every pilot who ever flew with dragons. They're still connected, still bound by what they shared." Sarah felt it then. A vast network of consciousness spanning the galaxy, invisible threads that connected every human who had ever earned the trust of a dragon. Most of those pilots were dead now, their minds long since returned to the cosmos, but their memories remained, embedded in the quantum foam like echoes of light from distant stars. "Help me call them home," continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Help me remember them back to life." Sarah didn't understand what the child was asking, not really. But she understood the desperation in her voice, and she understood that sometimes understanding wasn't necessary. Sometimes you just had to have faith. "Do it," she whispered, not sure if she was speaking aloud or thinking the words. "Whatever you need from us, take it." The response from the other pilots was immediate and unanimous. Across the squadron frequency came a chorus of agreement, men and women who had once sworn an oath to protect the innocent, offering themselves to a child they had never met. Reached out through the quantum network, her hybrid consciousness touching minds both living and dead. She called to pilots who had died defending evacuation ships, to wingmen who had sacrificed themselves to save there, to commanders who had held the line against impossible odds. She called to every human who had ever looked at a dragon and seen not a monster, but a partner. And impossibly, incredibly, they began to answer. Sarah felt it first as a tingling in her fingertips, then as a warmth that spread through her entire body. The controls of her ship seemed to respond before she touched them, as if guided by hands that knew exactly where to find every switch and dial. Her targeting computer locked onto fighters with inhuman precision, her weapons firing with a speed and accuracy that her conscious mind couldn't match. Around her, the other pilots were experiencing the same phenomenon. Their ships moved with impossible grace, executing maneuvers that should have been beyond their capabilities. Their weapons found targets with uncanny precision, and their coordination reached levels that they had never achieved even in their prime. They were no longer flying alone. In each cockpit sat the ghostly presence of every pilot who had ever died protecting others, their knowledge and experience flowing through living minds like water finding its level. The battle turned in an instant. Where before the Phoenix Squadron had been struggling against superior numbers and technology, now they moved like a force of nature. Their mismatched ships struck with the precision of surgical instruments, each attack perfectly coordinated with those of theirs. The fighters, programmed for efficiency and logic, found themselves facing opponents who fought with inhuman intuition and impossible luck. One by one, the alien ships began to fall. Sarah watched her targeting display as cargo hauler somehow managed to thread the needle between two interceptors, her improvised weapons striking both ships simultaneously. Patrol cutter performed a maneuver that would have been impossible for any living pilot, rolling through a gap in enemy fire that existed for less than a second. And through it all, flew at the center of their formation, her broken body somehow finding the strength to continue. The dragon's presence seemed to anchor the ghostly pilots to reality, giving them a focus for their protective instincts that transcended death itself. But the command ship was still charging its weapons. "Phoenix Leader," Hayes's voice crackled over the radio. "I'm reading critical energy levels from the command vessel. Whatever supernatural assistance we're getting, it won't matter if they vaporize the entire station." Sarah looked at her tactical display and realized he was right. The command ship hung at the edge of effective weapons range, its massive guns preparing to deliver a killing blow that would end the battle in a single, overwhelming strike. The Phoenix pilots had eliminated most of the fighters, but they lacked the firepower to penetrate the command ship's heavy armor. That was when spoke, her mental voice reaching out to touch every pilot simultaneously. Her thoughts carried the weight of centuries and the wisdom of a species that had swum between stars since before humans had discovered fire. "There is a way," she said, her consciousness joining the growing network of living and dead pilots. "But it will require trust beyond anything you have known. It will require you to fly not as humans, but as something more." Sarah felt a moment of vertigo as the dragon's mind touched hers directly, sharing memories of flights through nebulae that painted space in impossible colors, of battles fought in the corona of dying stars, of partnerships between human and dragon that had reshaped the very nature of consciousness itself. "Show us," Sarah replied without hesitation. Around her, the other pilots added their voices to the chorus of agreement. They were beyond questioning now, caught up in something larger than themselves, guided by instincts that belonged to both the living and the dead. His response was to share something that no human had ever experienced, the memory of what it was like to fly with a quantum-bonded partner, two consciousnesses merged into something greater than the sum of their parts. For an instant, Sarah felt what it was like to perceive space not as empty void, but as an ocean of possibility, to move not through mere physics, but through the fundamental forces that shaped reality itself. Now commanded, and suddenly Sarah understood. The Phoenix Squadron moved as one, their ships falling into a formation that existed in more than 3 dimensions. Space seemed to bend around them as they accelerated toward the command ship, their vessels no longer bound by the normal limitations of mass and inertia. They flew through quantum foam itself, taking shortcuts through reality that should not have existed. The command ship had no time to react. One moment it was preparing to fire on the mining station, and the next it was surrounded by human fighters that had somehow appeared inside its defensive perimeter. The aliens' weapons fired desperately, but their targeting systems couldn't lock onto ships that existed in a constant state of quantum uncertainty. The attack was over in seconds. Phoenix Squadron struck simultaneously from a dozen different angles, their weapons finding critical systems with surgical precision. The command ship's heavy armor meant nothing when the attacks came from within its own defensive grid, bypassing shields and point defense systems that had been designed to stop conventional assault. The massive vessel died without ceremony, its hull cracking open like an egg as atmosphere vented into space. Secondary explosions rippled through its structure as power conduits overloaded and ammunition stores detonated. Within minutes, nothing remained but expanding debris and the fatting glow of dissipating energy. In the sudden silence that followed, Sarah found herself floating in space near the mining station, her ship's engines quiet and her weapons powered down. Around her, the other Phoenix pilots hung motionless in their cockpits, their faces slack with exhaustion and wonder. The ghostly presence of the dead pilots was fading now, their mission complete. Sarah felt them withdrawing from her consciousness like a tide pulling back from shore, leaving behind only the memory of what it had felt like to be part of something infinite. "Thank you," Kame's voice, weak but triumphant. "Thank you for remembering us." Sarah smiled and keyed her radio. "Phoenix Squadron to Mining Station 442B. The threat has been neutralized. Request permission to come aboard and render assistance." The response came immediately, crackling with relief and gratitude. "Permission granted, Phoenix Leader. Base 7 is still pressurized and available for docking, and thank you, all of you." As Sarah guided her ship toward the damaged station, she could see moving slowly back toward the hull breach she had emerged from. The Dragon was clearly exhausted, her flight unsteady, but she was alive. They were all alive. For the first time in 20 years, Phoenix Squadron was going home. The Hangar awakens. The makeshift medical bay in Docking Bay 7 had become the most important place in the galaxy, though none of its occupants would have believed such a statement 6 hours earlier. Emergency lighting cast long shadows across jury-rigged equipment and hastily arranged supplies, as the surviving Phoenix pilots worked alongside mining station personnel to tend to the wounded. Sarah Martinez knelt beside a stretcher where lay unconscious, her face pale from blood loss but her vital signs stable. The quantum flight had taken its toll on all of them. Flying through dimensions that human minds weren't meant to comprehend had pushed their consciousness to the breaking point, leaving them exhausted and disoriented. But they were alive, and that was more than they had any right to expect. "How is she?" asked David Hayes, who was coordinating the medical effort with the efficiency of someone who had spent too many years dealing with combat casualties. "She'll live," Sarah replied, adjusting the IV drip that was keeping stable. "They all will, though I don't think any of us are going to be the same after this." Hayes nodded grimly. Around the bay, the other Phoenix pilots were receiving similar treatment. The quantum flight had affected each of them differently. Was suffering from severe migraines, James Kirk couldn't stop his hands from shaking, and Maria Santos kept muttering about seeing colors that didn't exist. But they were all breathing, all thinking, all fundamentally themselves. The real concern was in the sealed section of the bay where Doctor, the station's chief medical officer, was working on their most important patient. Lay curled in the center of a space that had been hastily cleared of cargo containers and emergency supplies. Her massive form dominated the area, even diminished as she was by years of captivity and malnutrition. Doctor moved around the Dragon with careful precision, her scanners painting the air with holographic displays that showed the extent of the damage. "It's extensive," Doctor reported to the gathered pilots. "Neural scarring throughout her spinal column, malnutrition that's weakened her bone structure, and what looks like chronic pain that's been building for years. I'm honestly amazed she was able to fly at all." "Can you help her?" Sarah asked, though she was afraid of the answer. Doctor hesitated, her eyes moving between the scanner readings and the dragon's labored breathing. I can treat the malnutrition and manage the pain, but the neural damage, that's beyond anything in my experience. Dragon physiology is still largely a mystery to human medicine. It was then that emerged from the corner where she had been quietly watching the proceedings. The hybrid child moved with the careful grace that marked her draconic heritage, but her golden eyes were filled with an intelligence that seemed far older than her 7 years. "May I see the scans?" she asked, her musical voice carrying harmonics that made the air itself seem to resonate. Doctor looked surprised, but she nodded and adjusted her displays so that could see them. The child studied the holographic images of her mother's nervous system with an intensity that was unsettling to watch. "Here," said finally, pointing to a cluster of damaged neural pathways near the base of skull. "And here, the connections are severed but not destroyed. They can be rebuilt but not with human medicine." "What do you mean?" Doctor asked. Instead of answering directly, walked over to where her mother lay and placed her small hand on the dragon's great head. Eye opened, focusing on her daughter with an effort that spoke of tremendous pain. "I know what they did to you," whispered, her voice carrying undertones of ancient sorrow. "The weapon they used, the one that was supposed to make dragons forget how to fly between the stars, it didn't work quite as they intended, did it?" Sai closed in what might have been confirmation or simply exhaustion. Turned to address the watching humans, her expression grave beyond her years. 20 years ago, when the alliance fell apart and dragons became inconvenient, certain factions within the government developed a weapon designed to sever our connection to the quantum foam. They called it a pacification device, claiming it would make dragons docile and manageable. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she began to understand the implications. "They used it on the dragon refugees," continued, her voice steady despite the tears that ran down her scaled cheeks. "Hundreds of my mother's people, shot down like animals and subjected to neural disruption that was supposed to make them forget their heritage. Most of them died. The few who survived were left broken, unable to access the quantum fields that allowed them to travel between stars." "Jesus Christ," whispered, his voice hoarse with disgust. "They lobotomized them." "Worse," replied. "They tried to cut them off from the very essence of what made them dragons, but the weapon was flawed. Instead of simply severing the quantum connections, it created feedback loops that caused constant pain. My mother has been suffering for 20 years, every moment of every day, because someone decided that dragons were too dangerous to be allowed their freedom." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of old crimes finally brought to light. Sarah found herself thinking of the official reports she had read years ago, documents that had described the post-war pacification of dragon refugees in clinical, sanitized language. She had never questioned the euphemisms, had never wondered what neural adjustment procedures actually meant in practice. Now she knew, and the knowledge made her sick. "Can the damage be reversed?" Hayes asked, his command training keeping his voice steady despite the obvious anger in his eyes. Nodded slowly. "The quantum connections can be restored, but it requires something that hasn't been attempted in decades. It requires a full-scale neural link between dragon and human, guided by someone who understands both halves of the equation." She looked directly at Sarah as she spoke, and her meaning was unmistakable. "You want me to link with your mother?" Sarah said, not really a question. "Not just you," replied. "All of you. The neural pathways that were damaged carry more than just quantum field access. They carry memories, experiences, the accumulated wisdom of centuries of flight. To restore them properly, they need to be anchored by minds that understand what it means to dance with dragons among the stars." Sarah looked around at her fellow pilots, seeing her own uncertainty reflected in their faces. What was proposing went far beyond anything they had attempted during their quantum flight. That had been guided by the ghostly presence of the dead, supported by forces they didn't understand. This would be a direct neural connection with an alien intelligence, with all the risks that implied. "Is it safe?" Doctor asked, clearly struggling to process what she was hearing. "No," admitted with the brutal honesty of childhood. "Neural linking is always dangerous, especially between species. There's a risk of feedback, of consciousness bleed, of mental damage that could leave you permanently changed. But without it, my mother will die slowly and in constant agony." She paused, her golden eyes moving from pilot to pilot. I know I have no right to ask this of you, she continued. You've already risked everything to save us, but you're the only ones who understand what she is, what she represents. You're the only ones who remember what it was like when dragons and humans fought side by side. The decision, when it came, was unanimous. Sarah wasn't surprised when Hayes nodded first, followed quickly by, and the others. They had come too far and sacrificed too much to turn back now. What do we need to do? Sarah asked. Smile was radiant, transforming her young face with a joy that seemed to light up the entire bay. Doctor, she said, turning to the medical officer, I need you to prepare neural interface units for each pilot. Standard exploration-grade equipment should be sufficient, though you'll need to modify them for extended connection duration. Doctor protested, those interfaces are designed for short-term data exchange between humans. Using them for direct neural linking with an alien consciousness could cause permanent brain damage. Not if it's done correctly, the child replied with confidence that was almost unsettling. My heritage gives me the ability to serve as a bridge between human and dragon consciousness. I can guide the process, ensure that the connection remains stable. As Doctor hurried off to prepare the equipment, turned her attention to the pilots themselves. Each of you will need to focus on specific memories, she explained. Times when you flew alongside dragons, moments when you felt the connection between your minds and ours. Those memories will serve as anchor points, preventing your consciousness from becoming lost in the quantum foam. Sarah nodded, her mind already turning to the memories that had sustained her through 20 years of exile and disappointment. The first time she had flown wing-to-wing with a dragon through the Veil Nebula. The battle over New Geneva, where she and her dragon partner had saved a convoy of refugee ships. The moment when she had felt another consciousness touch her mind and recognized it not as alien, but as kindred. Around her, the other pilots were making similar mental preparations. Their faces carried the distant look of people remembering better days, when the galaxy had been full of possibilities and hope hadn't been a luxury they couldn't afford. Doctor returned with the neural interfaces, sleek headsets that looked deceptively simple for devices capable of bridging the gap between minds. Each pilot took one and examined it with the careful attention that came from years of trusting their lives to unfamiliar technology. The interfaces will create a neural network linking all of you two, explained as they prepared to begin. I'll serve as the central hub, coordinating the flow of consciousness and ensuring that the repair process remains focused. But remember, this isn't just about fixing damaged neural pathways. We're trying to restore something that was deliberately destroyed to repair not just tissue but memory itself. She moved to stand beside her mother's great head, placing one small hand on the dragon's snout. His eye opened, focusing on her daughter with an effort that was clearly painful. Are you ready, Mother? Asked softly. The dragon's response came not as words, but as a complex emotional resonance that spoke of trust, love, and a desperate hope for an end to decades of suffering. We're ready, Sarah said, speaking for all of them as she activated her neural interface. The world exploded into sensation. Sarah felt her consciousness expand beyond the boundaries of her skull, reaching out through quantum fields to touch the minds of her fellow pilots. She could feel their thoughts, their memories, their fears and hopes intermingled with her own. But beyond them lay something vast and alien, the consciousness of a dragon, ancient and patient and filled with pain. Its mind was a labyrinth of damaged pathways and severed connections, neural architecture that had been deliberately savaged by weapons designed to destroy rather than heal. Sarah felt herself moving through memories that belonged to a being who had lived for centuries, who had seen the rise and fall of civilizations, who carried within her consciousness the accumulated wisdom of her entire species. But the memories were fragmented, broken by the scars left by the pacification weapon. Where there should have been clear recollections of quantum flight, there were gaps filled with static and pain. Where ancient knowledge should have flowed freely, there were barriers of damaged tissue that blocked the natural connections. Here's voice guided them through the neural maze. These are the primary quantum pathways. They need to be rebuilt from the quantum level up. Sarah felt herself reaching out with consciousness she didn't know she possessed, her memories of dragon flight serving as a template for the reconstruction. Beside her in the shared mental space, she could sense Hayes and the others doing the same thing, their combined experiences creating a framework of understanding that spanned the gap between species. The work was exhausting and delicate. Each neural pathway had to be rebuilt strand by strand, each connection restored with painstaking precision. Sarah found herself drawing on memories she hadn't accessed in years. The feeling of acceleration when a dragon began its quantum jump, the sensation of reality bending around them as they slipped between dimensional barriers, the indescribable joy of flying through spaces that existed between the stars themselves. But it wasn't just her memories they were using. Through the neural link, she could access the experiences of every pilot who had ever flown with dragons, their knowledge and understanding flowing through the quantum network like water finding its level. The ghostly presence of the dead had returned, not as active participants this time, but as a vast library of experience that could be drawn upon as needed. Hours passed, though time became meaningless in the shared consciousness of the neural link. Sarah lost track of her individual identity, becoming part of something larger and more complex than any single mind could encompass. She was Sarah Martinez, veteran pilot and freight hauler. She was former fighter ace turned patrol runner. She was cargo pilot and mother of 3. She was all of them and none of them, her consciousness distributed across a network that spanned species and conventional understanding. At the center of it all was her ancient mind serving as an anchor point for the reconstruction efforts. The dragon's consciousness was vast and patient, shaped by centuries of experience and wisdom that humbled the human pilots. But it was also wounded by decades of deliberate cruelty that had left her cut off from the quantum fields that were her birthright. Almost there, his voice guided them as they worked on the final connections. Just a few more pathways and the quantum loop will be complete. Sarah felt herself focusing on a particularly complex section of neural architecture, one that seemed to handle the translation between conscious thought and quantum field manipulation. The damage here was extensive, the original pathways completely destroyed by feedback from the pacification weapon. But the framework was still there, waiting to be rebuilt by minds that understood both the destination and the journey. She reached out with her consciousness, using her memories of quantum flight as a guide, and began to weave new connections from the raw material of possibility itself. Beside her in the shared mental space, her fellow pilots did the same, their combined efforts creating something that was greater than the sum of its parts. And then suddenly it was done. Sarah felt the moment when the final connection clicked into place, when the damaged neural pathways suddenly blazed to life with quantum energy that had been for 20 years. Through the link, she felt consciousness expand, reaching out to touch the quantum foam that underlay reality itself. The dragon's joy was overwhelming, a pure emotional resonance that brought tears to Sarah's physical eyes, even as her consciousness soared through dimensions she had never imagined. For the first time in 20 years, was whole again, her mind reconnected to the cosmic forces that defined her very existence. "Thank you," came the dragon's mental voice, clear and strong now instead of the broken whisper it had been before. "Thank you for giving me back the stars." The neural link dissolved gently, consciousness returning to individual minds as the pilots slowly awakened in the physical world. Sarah opened her eyes to find herself lying on a medical cot, her body trembling from exhaustion, but her mind clear and focused. Around her, the other pilots were experiencing similar awakenings, their faces reflecting the same mixture of exhaustion and wonder that she felt. But their attention was quickly drawn to the center of the bay, where was slowly rising to her full height for the first time in decades. The dragon's transformation was remarkable. Where before she had been a broken, diminished creature, now she radiated health and vitality that filled the entire space. Her scales gleamed with their original emerald brilliance, and her movements carried the fluid grace that spoke of perfect control over quantum forces. "Mother," cried out, running to embrace the great dragon's neck. Its response was a sound that none of the humans had ever heard before, the pure, crystalline note of draconic joy, a harmonic that resonated through multiple dimensions simultaneously. It was the sound of freedom reclaimed, of ancient wounds finally healed. My daughter's mental voice reached out to touch every mind in the bay, my brave, impossible daughter, and my newfound family of the stars. She turned her great head to look directly at Sarah and the other pilots. "You have given me more than my life back," she continued. "You have restored my connection to the infinite. But more than that, you have reminded me that the bonds between our species were never truly broken. They were only sleeping, waiting for the right moment to awaken." Sarah felt tears running down her cheeks, though she couldn't have said why. Perhaps it was the release of 20 years of accumulated grief and disappointment. Perhaps it was the realization that the partnership she had mourned was not dead, merely dormant. Or perhaps it was simply the recognition that sometimes, against all odds and expectations, the right thing could still triumph. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice hoarse from the neural link procedure. His response carried undertones of ancient wisdom and newfound hope. "Now we remember who we used to be, and we decide who we want to become." Outside the mining station, the stars waited in endless profusion, their light carrying the promise of adventures yet to come. In the makeshift medical bay, dragons and humans began to plan for a future that neither species could achieve alone, but together might build into something worthy of the infinite cosmos that surrounded them. The Phoenix Squadron was home at last, and the galaxy would never be the same.